Well, thank you all for coming to this seminar. It's great to see you here. We're going to spend the next kind of 50 minutes or so looking at how to love our neighbours in the LGBT community. Just a little background about me. I currently work for Agapé in Newcastle, and I guess I've been asked to do this seminar because I come from a lesbian background, so for me when I was growing up, being gay felt like a really natural thing. I had a nominal church upbringing, but I didn't understand the gospel. I just thought if you're good enough, then you might get into heaven if you're lucky. I became a Christian at university, which is a good place to become a Christian. And like a lot of Christian journeys, I've had my ups and downs since then. And early on in my Christian walk, I had a few relationships with women, it was painful wrestling with my faith during those times, and it was painful leaving those relationships. And since then I've wrestled with singleness and with sexual temptation and just trying to work out what the Bible says about these things and how to live out my faith. And I think a lot of my struggle rested on struggling to trust that God is really good. Fast forwarding on, I'm a bit older now, and I'm in a place where I know that God's way is best for me, so I can trust Him with my life, which is fantastic. And I actually think that the biblical teaching on sexuality is really good news as well. Now I recognise that all of us in the room will have different experiences, will have different backgrounds, maybe we're at very different stages of thinking through all this stuff, and that's absolutely fine. I want us to generate some discussion, to chat to each other, and to have time to ask questions at the end. I want to show you some map of where we're going in this seminar. It's quite ambitious, so I'm going to probably go quite fast, so buckle up. I want to really briefly look at our cultural climate and what our culture says about identity and sex, and then look at the biblical story, how that narrative sort of juxtaposes with what our culture says. And then I want to get into the more practical stuff about how we share our faith with our LGBT friends and how we love them well. I've got some further resources that I'm pointing to at the end, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So that's where we're going. It's quite ambitious, but we'll try and zoom through. So first of all, our cultural climate has some quite interesting stuff to say about identity and sex. Identity is no longer an external reality that defines who we are, but we're encouraged to build our own identity however we like. I think it's interesting how this plays out in advertising and stuff. It's not M&S anymore, it's your M&S. At Burger King, we're told to have it your way. I don't know if anyone remembers the Nikon camera adverts. There we are. It had a series of aspirational statements like I am creative and this sort of thing, and it ends with I am Nikon, which is really interesting because they're just selling cameras. But it's not I buy Nikon cameras anymore, it's I am Nikon. It's really interesting that brands are trying to shape who we think of ourselves to be. Whether we're aware of it or not, the media are subtly shaping our values and aspirations. We're being discipled by our TVs, by Instagram, by films and magazines. And none of us are immune from this. I've heard parents tell their children that if you put your mind to it, you can achieve anything, which sounds brilliant, doesn't it? But it's not right. However hard I try, I'm probably not going to be an Olympic skier, let alone a 6-foot-tall supermodel. And do you know what? That is all right. We don't all have to aspire to be the same thing. In a world where aspirations are sky high and we're told to go out and make our own identity, a lot of people are feeling lost and feeling like they're failures. And if identity is socially constructed, where do we draw the line? Can we really define reality and be whoever we want to be? Well, I was just idling about on YouTube and I found a really interesting video where students at the University of Washington were asked a number of questions about identity. So I just want to show you that now.
I told you that I was a woman. What would you respond to?
Good for you, okay? Like, yeah.
Nice to meet you. By the way. Really?
I don't have a problem
If I told you that I was Chinese, what would you respond to?
I mean, I might be a little surprised, but I would say, good for you. Like, yeah, be who you are.
I would maybe think you had some Chinese ancestor.
I would ask you how you stumbled into that conclusion and why you came to that conclusion.
I would ask that question just because on the outside I would assume that you're a white man.
If I told you that I was 7 years old, what would you respond to?
I would believe that immediately.
If you feel 7 at heart, then good for you.
If I told you I was 6 feet 5 inches, what would you say?
That I would question.
Why?
Because you're not. No, I don't think you're.
If you truly believe you're 6'5", I don't think it's harmful. I think it's fine if you believe that. It doesn't matter to me if you think you're taller than you are.
So you'd be willing to tell me I'm wrong?
I wouldn't tell you you're wrong.
No, but I say that I don't think that you are.
I feel like that's not my place as like another human to say someone is wrong or to draw lines and boundaries.
No, I mean, I would just feel like, oh, you're wrong and that's wrong to believe this. I mean, yeah, it doesn't really bother me what you want to think about your height or anything.
So I could be a Chinese woman.
Sure.
But I can't be a 6'5" Chinese woman.
If you thoroughly debated me or explained why you felt that you were 6'5", I feel like I would be very open to saying that you were 6'5", or Chinese, or a woman.
It's interesting, isn't it? So it seems like there's quite a big problem with this cultural narrative that we can shape our own identity and nobody can disagree with what we say about ourselves. So we find ourselves in this kind of strange and rapidly changing world where some of us feel out of place. But I think as Christians we really need to understand our cultural environment so that we can tell a positive story about identity and sexuality and really love people into the kingdom. So identity is the first thing, sex is the second thing. I think it's fairly obvious that sex is a primary goal in our culture. I want to show you what I call the sex equation. It's not maths, it's quite interesting. So we've got here that intimacy equals sex. Everybody needs intimacy. No sex means no intimacy, so everybody needs to be having sex. That's kind of how the reasoning goes. But just think about it to yourself. What's wrong with this argument? Can you think of forms of intimacy that don't involve sex? And how is this valuing people who aren't having sex? I think our society sends a strong message that you're not fulfilled if you're not having sex, that there's something wrong with you and you're missing out. I don't know if ever anyone remembers that awful film, The 40-Year-Old Virgin. It's I had the misfortune of seeing it. It's basically about this miserable guy he's miserable because he's 40 years old and he hasn't had sex yet. And the tagline is better late than never. It's almost like the worst thing that could ever happen to you in our culture is not having sex. We're going to return to the intimacy and sex equation a little bit later on. But all this raises questions about how we can be faithful to biblical teaching on sexuality whilst loving our friends in the LGBT community. So now we just need to have a little look at understanding the biblical story. And there are 4 things that I want to look at briefly. First is personal identity. So who has God created us to be? The second is the purpose and pattern for godly sex. The third is purity, living for God in a messed up world. And the last point to look at is the promise, what we can ultimately hope for. So personal identity. God's view of human identity is that we're not just random lumps of atoms. Our bodies aren't a disposable shell, they matter, and we have been created for eternity. And the key thing is that we don't define who we are, God does. We are God's image bearers, and we're made for a relationship with Him as male and female. And this is kind of how the Bible starts. God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. So this is the truth about us, that we're carefully and thoughtfully made by the God who loves us. Chance to show off my little nephew who was born just before Christmas. Arthur, he looks like a Thunderbird at the moment because he can't quite coordinate his limbs. But he's really cute, and it just makes me think about the amazingness of new life. The Bible says this: "You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made." That's who we are. Secondly, the purpose and pattern for people in sex. Relationship with God is what we're made for. It's our purpose. So where does sex come into this? Well, it's pretty clear from the Bible that it is a gift from God. It's a good thing for the context of marriage between a man and a woman. We think sometimes that Jesus doesn't really say anything about homosexuality, but Jesus talks a lot about sexuality and what that should look like. Jesus defines marriage in Matthew 19 by quoting Genesis 2:24, which says, "A man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they'll become one flesh." So there we have the Bible's definition of marriage. It's a unity in difference, male and female coming together. And Christian marriage isn't just about sort of two people hooking up who love each other and stuff. It's actually much more profound than that. It puts the gospel on display, and it points to the relationship between Jesus and the church, who are different but united to one another. So that's the biblical picture of what sex was created for. And all sex outside of this context, whether it's adultery or lust, or having straight sex if you're not married, or gay sex or whatever, or porn, all that is treated as sinful in the scriptures. And that's what Jesus calls sexual immorality in Mark 7. Jesus says, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, envy, slander, arrogance and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." There's some encouragements to take from what Jesus says there. Firstly, it's all encompassing. It doesn't leave anybody out. We all have broken sexualities, and we've all sinned in this area, whether in our bodies or in our minds. And it's interesting as well that sexual immorality is listed with loads of other things. It isn't worse than other sins, it isn't better than other sins, it's just one of the ways that we fall short of God's standards, alongside envy and slander and arrogance and all sorts of other things. Essentially, it stems from not taking God at his word and not trusting him and trying to make our own rules, and we kind of see that around us today in our culture. But we also need to make sure that we don't idolise marriage and make it more important than it is. It isn't the end goal, and it should point to God, not take his place. So what is the option if you're not married or you can't marry? Well, singleness is spoken of really highly in the New Testament. It's spoken of as a gift. For a lot of years I thought, well, it's a gift I don't really want, thanks very much. But turns out it is actually a really good thing. So let's go back to this sex equation. There we are. It seems to me that all but the second proposition are false. Intimacy and sex are not one and the same thing. Sex is certainly one way of experiencing intimacy with another person, but it's not the only way. We all experience intimacy in lots of non-sexual ways with people in our lives. Many of us will be brothers and sisters. We've certainly all had parents, even if they're no longer with us. And we all have friendships, some of which will be very close. And there are lots of amazing ways to experience deep intimacy with people that aren't sexual. Just put a few up there, but hugs and companionable silence, you know, those friends where you just share laughter and tears and mutual understanding and trust. These are the relationships that are open to everyone, and as Christians we've got a really good opportunity to model this type of living. These relationships aren't second best, and even if you are married or going out with someone, you need these network of relationships as well to stop idolising your partner or loading your romantic relationship with unrealistic expectations. And of course, as Christians, our most intimate relationship is with God. I think we sometimes say this, but we sometimes don't quite mean it, do we? But look at some of the most fulfilled people in the world, and I'm thinking Jesus and Paul, to be honest. Both of those people were fulfilled, experienced intimacy and purpose and meaning, and yet didn't have sex. So they're quite good role models to. It's always good to have Jesus as a as someone to look at and to follow. Knowing Jesus brings us into a new family, which means that we have parents and children and siblings and aunties and the occasional mad uncle, regardless of the makeup of our biological families. This seems like a brilliantly positive thing that we can say to the world. That you don't need to be in a sexual relationship to have value and meaning, because the creator of the universe loves you intimately and wants you to know him, and he wants to draw you into a community of loving people. And finally, promise. I think it's really helpful to remember that this world isn't it. The whole of history is heading towards a new creation and the ultimate wedding. The church is the bride and Christ is the bridegroom. That's an amazing picture, isn't it? So I'm going to get to be married one day to Christ. Make sure I get a good dress for that one. All imperfect earthly marriages have been pointing forward to this. In Revelation, it talks about the new creation, and it says this: I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. Sometimes we think about heaven as a bit sort of like floaty clouds and boringness, but it's not. It's going to be like this earth, but better, without the evil and without the hurt. So it's something amazing to look forward to. So this is the massively countercultural story that we're inviting our LGBT friends into. So now, for the second half, we're going to look at a bit more practical stuff. What can we actually do to live this story and to share this story with our friends? So first of all, just to check that you're all still awake, there's going to be a little bit of interaction. Just if people want to shout out, what are your fears in sharing your faith or talking about Christianity with your LGBT friends? Anyone got any particular things that they find difficult? Yeah. Yeah, that's never nice, is it? So that's being called a bigot. Yeah.
I think my biggest concern is that why can't I basically believe that Jesus is all of them, or that they're not part of the love of God. That's my very biggest fear, that I wouldn't explain it very well, and that then they would feel as if they're loved or not. They don't feel the standard, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So there's a concern about even the words that we use to make sure that we're communicating that we love people and that they're not excluded from the love of God. Yeah.
I guess my biggest would be calling them to give up so much that I think Christians themselves aren't giving up.
Yeah. That's a massive thing. So we feel like we're asking that the cost of discipleship is bigger for them, and that actually other Christians aren't following Jesus wholeheartedly and giving everything up for him as well. Yeah. Great.
Change to identity. Wow.
Yeah, identity is such a huge thing, isn't it? And it's very hard to speak into that area. Yeah. Yeah. Any more?
God blessed her in her relationship with other women as well. So I don't want to hurt, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah. So there's even a difference of theology amongst people who are Christians. Yeah. Yeah. That's very hard. Any more? Yeah.
Trying to change the viewpoint that you've had since you was younger, to kind of change it for that person, because you've got a certain mindset that you've always been told about that you want to be. And you're trying to change that mindset to kind of share your faith, and you're not sure how to go about it.
Yes, it's hard sometimes to deconstruct stuff that you've been brought up thinking, How does that relate to the people that we're meeting, and how do we sort of sensitively navigate? Yeah. Well, you've come up with some great stuff. I had a few ideas. I think we've covered pretty much all of those things. But realistically, it is tough. I mean, it's tough talking about Christianity with anyone. I think when we're talking with LGBT people, there may be preconceptions. There may be, it's a hot topic at the moment, and it's the language that we use and the way that we speak and the way that we live all make a huge difference. It's really good to recognise our fears, and do you know, I find real confidence in the fact that God understands and He knows that it's difficult, and I kind of feel like I'm not the person with all the right answers blasting in to tell somebody else what to do. I really like this quote that says, evangelism is simply one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. I really like that, because, it's not us and them, it's not I'm better than you, it's, I was really hungry and I found some tasty food, would you like a bit? Great. So we're going to look at some tips for sharing our faith with our gay friends. In a sense, it's exactly the same as how you share your faith with anybody. It involves loving people well, not treating people as projects or having a hidden agenda, but being willing to listen more than we talk, and being humble to recognise that we've all got broken relationships with God and with other people, no matter how that shows itself in our particular lives. So first of all, I think it's really important that we make it all about Jesus rather than sexuality. Remember that it's not your job to make people Christians or convict people of their sin. The important thing is to point people to Jesus. If you keep the focus on Jesus and people's need for Him rather than telling them that they need to change their behaviour, I mean, essentially the gospel is, you can't make yourself right. Come to Jesus, He will transform you. Not clean up your act and then you can come to Jesus. That's the wrong way round. And remember that we're all in the same boat. There's no us and them. The message of the gospel is for everyone, and it's the same for everyone. We're all sinful, but Jesus offers us forgiveness through His sacrifice on the cross. So life in Christ is wonderful, and it's challenging, and it's available to everybody. Second point, the harvest is ripe. I think we often assume that LGBT people won't be interested in the gospel, or that they will, that if we talk about Christianity, they'll be aggressive and defensive, and certainly that is the case for some people. But a lot of LGBT people have had Christian backgrounds, and I've met many people who are spiritually hungry and curious, but they're often just as afraid that they're going to be rejected by the church, so there isn't a safe space for them to be able to ask their questions and to explore faith. It's really important to pray. It's essential to recognise what's God's job and what's ours, and recognise that the Holy Spirit is at work. That kind of takes the pressure off a bit, doesn't it? We can't persuade people to become Christians by clever arguments or even by being really nice people. The Holy Spirit's the only person who can bring people into God's kingdom. So we need to pray that God will help us love our friends, for the strength and wisdom and humility and spiritual opportunities, for wisdom to know who to invest in, and if there are any unhelpful situations that we shouldn't get ourselves into. And for other Christians to help us reach the LGBT community. These are people who God really loves and Jesus died for. And we want to be taking the good news to them. Which leads me on to my next point, which is go. The Great Commission tells us to go. Jesus went to where people were. I think sometimes it's a little bit unreasonable if we expect, we put on Christian events and we expect LGBT people to come to them, and then we wonder why nobody's come to them. And I think it's because often it just feels like an alien in a scary place. It's too big a step. So we need to be prepared to go to the places where they feel comfortable and where their community meets. Obviously we need wisdom and discernment about this. And we can ask Christians for their prayer and help us to be discerning. But I think this is a really good point from the book God's Space, which I heartily recommend. It's not an LGBT stuff, it's just a really good evangelism book. For many, going to church is as scary as going to a hardcore biker bar might be to Christians. So yeah, if you think about somewhere that you personally would find it really uncomfortable to go, that is possibly how your LGBT friend feels about coming to church or coming to a Christian meeting. People are much more likely to have spiritually open conversations if they're in a setting that feels safe. And actually, we need to not make assumptions about what that is. I think I really struggled when I first became a Christian because my safe place was the pub and the pool hall and everything. And then I became a Christian and I had to go to coffee shops with people and I went on a spa day and I was just like, this is so stressful. I don't know what to do. So we might think we're being nice, but actually we need to recognise what people will feel much more comfortable with and go with that. I really like this quote as well. Effective evangelism starts where people are, not where we would like them to be. Next point is about building community. I think sometimes the way we go about sharing our faith is quite lonely and hard work. Sometimes we sort of we put pressure on ourselves to go and talk to our friends during the week and then sort of report back about how well it went. But I really like the idea of being a sort of community on mission. And again, I found this video which I thought was really helpful. So we're just going to have a quick look now.
Many Christians get together regularly in what they call small groups, where they pray together, study the Bible, encourage one another, and sometimes have a meal together. This is a good thing. But then they often go off all by themselves to share the gospel with their friends, and many times they come back very discouraged because they aren't very effective. But Jesus never sent his disciples off by themselves. He sent them out in pairs. And the Apostle Paul went on a mission with the whole team. That's because Jesus told us it's by our love for one another that the world will know that we are his disciples. I encourage a group of people to be a community on mission, or a missional community, where they love one another and are sent together to a group of people. We want this group to see this community of people loving one another, because it's by our love for one another that they'll be able to see that the gospel changes us. This could look a number of different ways. It could be a party that we throw and invite some of our friends to attend. It could also be a few of us going to a party that others throw. It could be us inviting some people we know to come serve others with us so that they can see our love in action. Either way, we want to get people who love Jesus to love one another in the midst of a group of people who don't know the love of Jesus. Jesus' intent is for us to be a community on mission, not a bunch of individuals.
That stops really abruptly there, doesn't it? But I really like that because I think there's a lot of good about doing mission in community. It feels very like the early church in Acts, and that it puts the gospel on display. People can see the way that we relate to each other, and that they can be part of that. As Christians, we're called to be countercultural. I think one of the most pressing needs in our society is for community. We're a very individualistic society, and loneliness and isolation are two of our biggest struggles. Mission is a team sport. It's about sharing our lives with one another and allowing those who aren't Christians yet to experience the joy of godly community, to be part of the gospel in action. We can go out to where people are rather than expecting them to come to us, being a blessing and serving people in our community. I think that speaks really powerfully to the LGBT community. Rather than sort of debating them on ethics, being people who love them and love spending time with them and hanging out and being family together is huge. So let's try and build community where there's genuine respect and desire to value one another, which leads naturally to opportunities to share the hope that we have in Jesus. So building on that, community is the context where we build relationships with people. So let's look at some ways to deepen friendships. First of all, really love people. Sometimes I really struggle with that because people are annoying, aren't they? Lots of them are. I'm annoying. I annoy myself sometimes. I sometimes hear people saying that their LGBT friends just aren't interested in the gospel. But I've never met anyone who isn't interested in being loved and being listened to and being valued. I think we can be tempted to jump in with all sorts of defences of faith whenever someone shows the slightest bit of interest in Christianity. But we need to be careful that we're not answering questions that people aren't asking. We need to invest time in listening to people and seeking to understand what they think and feel. I think particularly a lot of my LGBT friends have been hurt and rejected and marginalised. And actually properly listening to them and investing time in them can communicate an enormous amount of love and compassion. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is that how you say it? Yeah. Excellent, I'm getting nods. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it among Christians because we are talking when we should be listening. That's challenging. We need to be asking good questions to show that we're genuinely interested. Another quote, good questions serve as a spiritual stethoscope to reveal the attitudes of one's heart towards God. They also lead to self-discovery and communicate respect and dignity. I mentioned this earlier, but don't have an agenda or treat people as projects. It's not us versus them. People are very wary of any sort of cynical sales techniques. How many evangelism programs, lost my place, have you encountered in which sharing the gospel assumes no relationship with the customer and Jesus is sold like soap? We're not just trying to get people to change their beliefs so that they believe the right thing. We want to invest in relationship and draw people into a relationship with God. And we need to keep our eyes open for God-given opportunities and for people that He's calling us to invest in. God's at work already in our world before we turn up. That's unusual, isn't it? He doesn't actually need us. He's doing stuff in people's hearts. So we need to be humble and directed by the Spirit to join in with what God's up to. Be humble. Recognise that we don't have all the answers. We're all broken and imperfect people. Praying with people is good as well. I never used to do that. I always used to think, if I'm with a Christian, we can do the praying thing. If I'm not with a Christian, they're going to be freaked out by that. But then I was really challenged by my friend Kimberly, actually, in Newcastle, that she just kind of offers to pray with people, and loads of people do want prayer, even if they're not Christians. So that can be a really good way to invest in people and to share faith. And finally, be patient and persevere. God is enormously patient with us when we mess up time and time again, or we fail to grow, we go down all sorts of dead ends. And we need to invest in people for the long term and be patient and persevere with them. Another thing that I found really helpful is to serve people in practical ways. I think because there are so many controversies, aren't there, around homosexuality and transgender issues, that LGBT people may assume that any sort of encounter with a Christian is going to be a debate or a discussion. They might be expecting to be told that their lifestyle is wrong or to be given a lecture about sexuality. But what they might not be expecting is for a Christian to offer to run some errands for them or to help with an application form, just to be a servant-hearted person. I think it's a really powerful demonstration of love when Christians offer to serve LGBT friends in practical ways. In a previous job, I had a boss who was a militant lesbian, and she had quite strong views about that. And we did have some decent discussions, but actually what really opened the way for me to be able to talk about my faith was when some Christian friends came round to help with my garden, and she just couldn't get why they were all giving up their Saturday to come and help mow my lawn and chop my trees and stuff. And then it opened up opportunities for me to help her, give her lifts and things. And then, she saw the way that we lived and noticed something different about it and naturally wanted to ask questions. So I found that really, really helpful. I found a quote from a guy called Steve Joran, I think it is. He said, "Deeds of love allow us to sneak into the hearts of those we serve. They are not enough on their own to bring someone to Christ, but they do create phone wires for transmitting the spoken message." I found that quite powerful. And finally, this is something that Delvin's question brought up. We need to take our own discipleship seriously. I think the biblical teaching on identity and sexuality isn't homophobic or transphobic. It's actually life-giving, but it is massively challenging. And that's to us all. Every single one of us has a broken sexuality. No one escapes the challenge, and we're called to die to ourselves, take up our cross and follow Jesus. The cost of discipleship is everything for all of us. That is about as inclusive as you can get, isn't it? Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it." You know, sometimes people say, "Oh, isn't it really hard that we're asking people to, possibly never have sex again? Isn't that unreasonable or an embarrassing thing to ask people?" And I often say, oh, it's much worse than that. Jesus says you have to die to yourself and become slaves to righteousness. That's not just gay or trans people, that's everybody. He says to us all, stop making sex an idol, stop finding security in material possessions, relationships, respectable jobs, status. Follow me wherever it leads, live counterculturally. I'm convinced that if more Christians took this call seriously, then the world would take notice and would actually listen to us on sexuality. Because it's part of a bigger story that means whole life discipleship, whatever our background and whatever our struggles. As Christians, we're to look different from the people around us, aren't we? We shouldn't make this world our home and adopt its cultural values for ourselves. We truly have a better story to tell, and if we live like this, people will notice. I really like this quote by a guy called Dean Fleming. He says, "Answers worth hearing flow from lives that are worth questioning." So let's live radically different lives before a watching world and see what God does. So that's the talk. I have a handout, which I'm going to ask Delvin to hand out. It's got a load of resources on it, like websites and books and all sorts of things I think you might find helpful. So yeah, do take that. I think there are plenty of copies, so if people haven't been in this seminar, they can have some as well. And we've got a bit of time for questions, discussion, sharing thoughts and ideas. I realise there's a lot there and I went really fast. So have some time to process, and then if anyone's got any questions, do let me know.
One question.
Yeah.
So I think the hardest one is when you're put on the spot and then you're asked that, a really pointed question like, am I going to hell because I'm gay? And do I have to give that up to become gay? How would you? I know it's a really hard question anyway, but how would you answer that?
So the question is, what do you do when you're put on the spot by somebody who says, am I going to hell because I'm gay? And do I have to sort of stop being gay? It's really difficult, isn't it? Because I think it's hard to sum up the whole of the biblical story in a soundbite. There are lots of kind of very Instagrammable sort of love wins and this sort of thing, love has no boundaries. And there are lots of things that kind of tie into the cultural message that are very easy to share, and people don't often unpick what that actually is saying. There aren't often equivalent things that we can put out there that will explain adequately where we're coming from. It is really difficult. I think in some ways I'm in a really privileged position because I can say, well, I can just tell my story, which often kind of diffuses things a little bit because it's hard to argue with somebody's personal experience. And I mean, I have been called homophobic, which is interesting. But yeah, I think I I'd probably try and unpick why they're asking the question. I'd maybe throw another question back to them and say something like, have you read the Bible? Do you I'm interested in why you're asking that question. Where have you sort of picked up on what the Bible says about sexuality? I'd love to hear a bit more about where you're coming from. Try and get it into a longer dialogue, and then share a bit of your own kind of personal experience. It doesn't have to be about homosexuality, but as I said before, we all struggle with sexuality, however that looks, and the cost of following Jesus in this area is high for everybody. I don't think I would ever say to somebody, yes, you're going to hell. I think I would try and frame it much more positively and try and talk about the broken relationship with God that we all have because we've all rebelled from Him, but the fact that the good news is that relationship can be restored, and try and speak into it that way. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it's hard. It's really hard when people do that.
I guess you kind of say that without saying it explicitly, like it's just as likely as any of my sins will lead me to hell. It's not more bad than the others. I guess that's the
I think that's really helpful that we are all in the same boat. Exactly, and we're not. Even the fact that we're Christians. There's an old phrase saying, "There, but for the grace of God go I," and that's true. If I didn't have God in my life, right now my life would be a mess. And so I think we always need to stay humble and always need to recognise that the only difference between us and non-Christians is nothing we've done. It's the fact that the Holy Spirit is in us and that Jesus has saved us, and that's very humbling, and it helps us to love people and to be patient with people as they wrestle through all this stuff. But great questions. Thank you, Darwin. Anyone else got stuff they're chewing through or want to ask?
What would you say to homosexuals who say that because of John 3:16 the same now changing?
So if God so loved the world that He gave His Son, I suppose we need to look at what love means. Yes, they are loved, but the challenge of the gospel is that we are loved exactly as we are, but God doesn't want us to stay like that. We are loved into the kingdom and then transformed. So, my life looked broken in a lot of ways, not just sexuality. When I became a Christian, I was drinking far too much. God loved me, but He also didn't want me to be an addict to alcohol. He wanted to transform me from that. So, I think it's difficult in our culture, isn't it? Because I think we've set up this expectation that if we are for somebody, if we love somebody, then we can't disagree with anything that they do, and that's in fact not loving. We need to try and unpick that, and we need to try and recognise that because God loves us that He wants us to change. I wouldn't think much of my mum really if she was quite happy for me to be an alcoholic, and that she didn't care if I was addicted to alcohol or not. That I would feel like she didn't care about me rather than that she did. So I think actually using a parent-child analogy can help sometimes. That sort of framing it in terms of, well, if you love a child, you don't just let them do whatever they want, because they'll run into the road, they'll lick a plug socket. Children are idiots. You need to kind of have some boundaries for them if they're going to grow properly. It's that distinction between being loved but being transformed. Does that help? Cool. There's a couple more.
I just feel like this is a question that becomes political. How do you avoid that, and how would you, and whether or not someone is homosexual or not, it just overcome conversation in political. So how would you avoid that?
There's some questions about that this often becomes a political issue. I think that's really helpful to pick up on that, because I think often LGBT people feel caught in the middle of a big argument that's going on in the media, and the church is weighing in on one side, and LGBT advocacy groups like Stonewall are weighing in on another side, and it kind of feels like just all stop arguing and care about me, please. I think there are some things that I think aren't particularly helpful. So social media has got a lot to answer for, I think, when it comes to how people engage. I think I've seen a lot of Christians disappointingly being very hostile towards others of different viewpoints on social media. I think it's a forum where it's very difficult to have nuance. It's very difficult to show how much you care about people, and it does tend to polarise arguments and just create division. So, you know, if anybody's trying to engage with you on the subject that way, I would want to take it offline and either personal message, or if you can meet up with them in person, even better. You know, it's much better done relationally. I question really the wisdom of Christians kind of going to things with placards and campaigning against stuff. I think there's a space for Christians speaking truth in the public sphere, but I think we've got to be very careful about how we do it. I would love it if the message that we were giving out was much more positive, and actually there are things that are much more rampant and much more dangerous that we should be making more of a fuss about, like consumerism, for instance, and materialism, and the way that we trash the environment. So I'd love it if we spoke a bit more about those things and a bit less about sexuality. So I think if we kind of invest in people's lives and try and have conversations one-to-one and in groups and do this missional community stuff, I think that's much better than trying to sort of campaign, and it's just A, it's sending the wrong message, and B, I feel like it's trying to change people's behaviour when they've not met Christ, and it just feels like that's the wrong thing to do. We ought to be inviting people into God's kingdom and loving them into God's kingdom rather than saying change your behaviour. So I think I've rambled there. Did I answer the question? Okay, cool. Was there another?
So the choice of
celibacy.
For LGBT people, when that's proposed to them, I guess, beyond like it being just the choice of like not having sex, some might also see it like denouncing also having romantic relationships altogether. So like some both like advocates for us to be with other people and have the community beyond that, like just having companionship in that manner, even if it does go to like a sexual thing. Is that even like agreeable with what the scripture says, or should romantic relationships as well as sexual relationships for LGBT people?
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So, as well as saying that same-sex attracted people can't have sex with each other, you're saying, what about romantic relationships? How would you define that? I'm not sure.
It's a thin line between like if you are in a romantic LGBT like relationship and for it to cross over into like a sexual relationship, does that mean if you deny your sexual side that you also must like forego the romantic side of like your needs? Because I guess you can fill it in with like community and friendships and family, but does the romantic side need to also be important?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question's about, as well as sort of being celibate in your sex life, what about the kind of romantic intimacy that people experience? I think we need to be careful that we don't kind of lead ourselves into temptation. So if you're tempted to have sex with somebody, then kind of holding hands with them or doing stuff that might lead to that is probably not a wise thing to do. But I certainly think there's a lot of room for much deeper and richer friendships than we actually experience at the moment. I mean, I share a house with a friend. We've lived together for 10 years, which is great. I mean, she's like a sister to me. And so, you know, we have a really close relationship, and we're committed to each other, and, you know, we share things and go on holiday together and stuff. But it's completely sort of non-sexual and non-romantic, but I think that's a really good and really positive thing, and it's kind of quite telling that a lot of people who don't really know us very well think that we're in a sexual relationship because they have no other way of categorising it. But in actual fact, you know, it shouldn't be loneliness on one end and having sex on the other end. There should be lots of stuff in the middle, and I think this is where we as Christians and as churches can really make a massive difference. I think we can model what proper friendship looks like, and actually being committed to one another, sharing life together in a way that we don't really see very much at the moment. So I think there's definitely room for real companionship and real committed friendship, but I would always say just kind of try and steer away from temptation, because I know I've tried to, you know, see what I can get away with, and that doesn't work. It kind of shows that your heart's in the wrong place as well, you know. But I think that's a really excellent question. Thank you.